Hi, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to welcome you all, wherever you are, or wherever you may be, as RIBA members or just interested people, to the latest Global Small Talk event of 2021. This is Expo 2020 Dubai, iconic UK design. We are hoping you might just pause and enjoy this conversation across the globe with me and my colleagues. I happen to be in the RIBA at Portland Place, but today's event, of course, has a special focus on the Expo 2020 Dubai. This is a unique opportunity to hear from 3 RIBA architects commissioned to design schemes for the event. I would like to introduce you to our 3 guest speakers: Gerard Evanden, Senior Executive Partner at Foster & Partners, Andrew Whalley, Chairman at Grimshaw, and Simon Fraser, Principal at Hopkins Architects. Today, our 3 speakers will be each sharing a presentation on their landmark schemes produced for the Expo 2020 Dubai. After the 3 presentations, I'll be hosting a discussion and Q&A with our speakers. Before I welcome our first speaker, I need to outline a few bits of housekeeping tips to make sure you have a good experience today. The event is recorded and will be shared on the RIBA YouTube channel alongside the previous Global Small Talks events that are available for you to watch at your leisure. Your microphones are muted throughout the event, so please feel free to type any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will respond to as many as we can after the presentations. If you wish, please feel free to indicate who you are and the name of your company. It would be great to know where everybody has come from around the globe. If we don't get time to answer all the questions, we'll aim to respond to specific questions after the event. So, taking a breath, it's time for me to introduce our first guest speaker, Gerard Evanden, who will be presenting Allies, the Mobility Pavilion. What you need to do is to step into the future where smart cities are created through artificial intelligence, big data, robotics, machine learning, and autonomous transport. Learn about the complexity of moving goods around the world and how mobility could evolve in the human-centered city of the future. Gerard is a senior executive partner, head of studio, and part of the design board at Foster & Partners. He's been responsible for a number of schemes in the United Arab Emirates, including the Reem Island Residences, Sheikh Zayed's National Museum, the Index, the World Trade Center Souk, and Masdar City. His team has also developed the design of modular housing for manufacture and distribution in large numbers and realized a prototype in Abu Dhabi. The sustainability focus that runs through these projects is also demonstrated by the 2 UAE pavilions designed for the Shanghai and Milan World Expos, which were constructed in China and Milan respectively and subsequently dismantled and relocated to their permanent home in Abu Dhabi. Gerard is leading Circular Quay Tower, which will include the highest commercial floor plate in Australia, and his current work in the Middle East includes Coral Bloom, the ambitious regenerative tourism project on the Red Sea coast, 2 airports, and the Mobility Pavilion of the 2021 Dubai Expo, which is the subject of today's talk. So, over to you, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you, Jo, and welcome everybody to the Mobility Pavilion. I think that what is interesting about any expo is what expos are, and really they are a opportunity to demonstrate new technology and new ideas, and very importantly, they need to represent and contain a number of components if they're going to be successful. And having been now already to 2 expos previously in Milan and Shanghai, we really wanted to learn from what we'd seen elsewhere and how you produce something which is memorable and which is lasting, which for us is what expos are all about. So the first thing with any pavilion, a fun experience, an experience that you remember, an experience that you interface with in a fun way, a learning experience, a personal journey. As you're taken through the pavilion, it's important that you come away with a story, with understanding the topic of the pavilion. And then the immersion of the pavilion that you feel that you're immersed in a new world, in a world about the topic. And finally, a single message, a very clear, strong message from the architectural form, which inspires the question. And in our case, that was mobility. In addition to that, with this particular pavilion, we had it was really the end of a long journey with pavilions in the expos that we'd done. And in the Shanghai Expo in 2010, we started with a pavilion which was designed and going to be following the expo, as many expos be demolished following the expo. And partway through that process, the UAE asked us to retain the pavilion and whether or not the pavilion could be redesigned and transported back to Abu Dhabi. And so in the 2010 expo, we redesigned the pavilion, made it movable, and eventually it was moved back to Abu Dhabi. And we saw that legacy program as very important. In Milan, the pavilion in Milan for the UAE, we took another step further in that we designed the pavilion from day one to be a pavilion that could be moved, and the pavilion was taken down in Milan, and now it's rebuilt and operational again in Abu Dhabi in 2018. But what was interesting about this pavilion was this was one of the signature pavilions, and the Mobility Pavilion is there for the long term, as are the other signature pavilions, and therefore we had to look at how to adapt and how we could reuse the building later on, and I will come to that through the process of the presentation. The pavilion site itself, the Mobility Pavilion, for us was two things. It was a great subject. It was a subject that we were very, very interested in. We think it's even become more topical as time has gone on. The mobility of people, the mobility of data, these have all become very relevant during the COVID period that we've just all been through. The pavilion itself, located on the southern part of the site, it's in one of the highest points of the site, and so it looks back down onto the site, and is right next to one of the major entrances. When we were given the brief, there were three distinct areas within the brief: the physical world, the digital world, and the unified world. And with a triangular site, it really led us to a trifoil building, which was really a building to create three vessels, and three vessels which would house, each vessel would house one of the sub-themes of the pavilion. And so by working through numerous iterations and then leading to this trifoil loop of mobility and movement through the building, we ended up with our trifoil form. So the three legs of the pavilion, each with a separate identity, each with a separate show, and providing a theatre for the individual topics within. In addition to that, one of the biggest issues about any expo is the queuing. And as you walk around an expo, a successful expo, one of the biggest periods of time that people spend is in the queue. And also, an expo is an incredibly exhausting experience. You can be there 2-3 days, and so resting, sitting, contemplating what you've seen is a very important part of the whole atmosphere, whether during the day or at night. So how could we produce a pavilion that sat in a landscape, and where that landscape also reacted to the message of the pavilion, in this case mobility. And then begin to think about the architectural forms. How could we express mobility in a dynamic way that even if you didn't actually get within the pavilion itself, you could experience mobility from the outside? And so around the site, so we have our trifoil building centered in the central part of the site, and then around our site we have 3 tracks. These tracks will be for demonstrations of devices, mobility devices. There's a high-speed track, almost 330 meters, running around the perimeter of the site, and then 2 slower tracks, a junior track for children, and then two other external areas: the bowl, which will contain an auditorium space, a cafe which opens out onto that auditorium, and then a stage for performances during the day and during the evenings as the expo goes on. And that leads us to our diagram and our image of the pavilion as it is today. So the trifoil form, and then this fairground of attraction around the pavilion, so that as you queue, as you enter the pavilion, you're entertained. You see the mobility. You can ride on the mobility devices, and that story is inside and outside. Another issue is the climate, and we're now dealing with a climate of Dubai, 30 degrees or more at times. And so how could building and how could these external areas also be controlled in terms of shade, and how could we provide shading and an experience for the visitor queuing that would be appropriate in the climate? And so the building is raked 50 degrees, an angle of 50 degrees, to cut out the direct sunlight from the edges of the building, and that allows and creates a shaded environment. And as you can see from these photographs, the shaded environment in which people can sit and actually queue adjacent to the entrance of the building. And so the building itself forming this shading canopy for the activities that have to happen at the ground level. The aerodynamic form of the building is really inspired through the wind tunnel, and looking at the forms in which air passes over objects, and could that form, could we use those forms to create a building that was dynamic, almost moving, almost propeller-like? And with that, the technology of the aircraft, the ability to manufacture precise elements for cladding, which would then lead to a more dynamic and moving building. So we set about looking at the cladding through parametric modelling. We looked at making some repetition within the panelling, and through that created really 6 major panel systems, which then sit onto the building. Depending on where they are and depending on the angle of the sun and where there's solid or glazing on the building, the blades that move around horizontally around the building open up or close up depending on where they are located. And the 50-degree inclination of the building then cutting out that direct solar impact at ground level. That was developed and through mock-ups, through prototypes, through very detailed modelling. We created a full-size mock-up. The choice of stainless steel was incredibly important. One, because we felt we needed a material which was robust in the environment in Dubai, had a longevity for the legacy, but also a material that would pick up light, a material that would pick up objects around the building. And we were very clear that Expos work day and night, and the building should change. The building should change as you see it at different times. So people regularly visit Expos, perhaps more than once, and therefore we wanted a dynamic to the building where the building changed depending on the time of day, depending on the mood of the situation, which led to this mobile facade. The principles of construction, fairly simple really, a tubular form which we could bend to the radiuses that we required around the building, and then by welding stainless steel plate to that and polishing, we were able to create the fins that you now see. And the building itself, really this composition of light from around the site, and the reflections of the perimeter of the site really coming into the building, and movement. And so the building is all about movement, whether at day or at night. And then as the fairground, as the attraction at ground level begins to move, we've introduced further light into that ground plane, into that landscape, in order to create more and more and generate more and more activity and movement. And interestingly, as the sun goes down, we see the pavilion changing colour. We see the effects of the Dubai sun moving across the building, a reddening of the building in the sunset. And then as we move to night, a light show begins that revolves around the building, and which creates the moving facade, and building on that atmosphere of the mobility within. So the mechanics of the building, how does the building work? Well, we had 30,000 visitors per day in the brief. How do you move 30,000 visitors through the building, and how do we do it in a way in which it won't be exhausting for them? And really, how you control the passage of people moving through the buildings is absolutely critical in any successful pavilion. And so our diagram in the end relied on, as you enter, you collect 168 people together, and you lift them in what we believe is the world's largest platform to the upper level, to the highest level in the building. And as people then leave the platform, they transfer and move down through the building through Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, which are the sub-themes, and then exit back into the landscape. So there's an active landscape when you arrive, and there's an active landscape that you're delivered in at the end of the experience. The platform itself, it's 10 meters in diameter. It can carry up to 168 passengers, and as the platform moves up, the show begins, and you're immersed in the show and the show of mobility. And importantly, the platform becomes a very important element later in the legacy, because the platform in the legacy is removed and can be reused elsewhere in Dubai, and the hole that is left becomes an atrium within the legacy building. Now, again, interestingly, the structure of the building is in total equilibrium. So just as mobility, successful mobility, relies on an equilibrium of forces, the building itself is in pure equilibrium. So the three petals of the building, balanced back to this concrete core of the building, allows this hybrid structure which minimizes the material in the building, but also allows for these huge cantilevers to these 50-degree inclines, which then provide the shading for the surrounding area. the BIM model, 330,000 elements within the building, and really a fully integrated architectural process, engineering, architecture, really integrating together to produce this building with a full integration of servicing. And then the building itself, during the Expo, the digital world, the unified world, and the physical world create the theatre spaces for the Expo to take place. And then following the Expo, we infill those zones with more floor plates. That's added to the building. Nothing's taken away. The platform is slipped out of the building and the atrium appears. And that becomes the building for the legacy. You can see the this was with the removal of the platform in the middle and then the floor plates filled in. In terms of sustainability, the building's LEED Gold, photovoltaic panels on the roof, 75% of the hot water demand coming from the solar thermal tubes on the roof, self-shading, and 70 credits in terms of the LEED Gold status. So a very healthy LEED Gold building. And for us, probably the greatest success of the Expo, in 2016, when we all stood on the site and said, will this ever be done? And today, it's a reality. Thank you.
Well, Gerard, thank you so much. That was completely fascinating. I've got lots of questions about the immersive experience and how people do a fast track in a 35-degree temperature, etc., etc. But I'm sure lots of those questions will come through in the Q&A. My job is now to hand over to Andrew, yes, to Andrew, getting myself in a muddle, to Andrew Whalley, who will be presenting Terra, the Sustainability Pavilion. For those people who haven't seen this yet, Terra has the highest available accreditation for sustainable architecture, LEED Platinum certification with 4,912 solar panels, a 130-metre wide canopy, and 18 energy trees helping to generate 4G of alternative energy per year. Andrew has been an instrumental part of Grimshaw since the earliest days of the practice and has been a partner in charge of projects in diverse sectors, including education, the performing arts, transportation, and workplace. His award-winning projects include the International Terminal at Waterloo in London, the Eden Project in Cornwall, the redevelopment of historic Paddington Station, also in London, and the Experimental and Performing Arts Building in Troy, New York. In 2001, Andrew established the New York studio for Grimshaw, which was one of 8 architectural practices selected for major public projects under Mayor Bloomberg's Design Excellence Programme. He qualified in the UK, but also in the USA, and has been involved in academia in both the UK and the US, recently completing his appointment also as adjunct professor at Politecnico Milano, so Polytechnic of Milan for the rest of us. Andrew was appointed as deputy chairman in 2011 of Grimshaw and succeeded Sir Nicholas Grimshaw as chairman in June 2019. He is responsible for managing the practice's core design ethos, brand identity, and working to build relationships to strengthen the profile of the practice around the world. Andrew, with no hesitation, I look over to you to present your Expo 2020 Dubai scheme.
Thank you very much, Joe. So I can actually also pick up on some of Gerard's themes as well, which is good. And I think as we follow through to Simon, we'll be able to give you a much more complete picture of the whole of Expo. Gerard took part in the competition for mobility. We took part in the competition for sustainability. So there was competitions for each of the anchor pavilions. And when we went to put forward our ideas, we felt it was absolutely essential that it was done with no compromise. So the building was really totally sustainable. And in many ways we thought, well, here's an international platform. And if you can demonstrate that you can build a building that's completely self-sustaining, generating all its own power, cooling, water, dealing with its own waste, then really you can do that anywhere. So that was very much, if you like, the starting point for us. Earlier on, the kind of master plan layout. And so there are the three petals, and the blue buildings in the middle are all the permanent buildings that Simon's going to talk about next. And in my mind, what's wonderful about this particular expo is that 70% of the buildings are permanent. And so particularly with the buildings you're going to hear about next, it gives the whole expo the feeling of it being a permanent city rather than the normal transient feel you often get with expos. And so this will very much become really an extension to Dubai, and in the long term, a kind of centre for, I think. So it's, it's part to be part of. And so our interest in sustainability really goes back almost, I think, 40 years, over 40 years, when Nick Grimshaw first set up the practice, and he wrote an article about the importance of sustainability for the RIBA journal. And for myself, probably over 30 years ago, we designed the British Pavilion for the World Expo in Seville. And our entry there was to really explore what would a sustainable architecture be, and how would it inform the kind of vocabulary of the architecture. It was one of the first times PVs had been used as part of a system for a building. And here it kind of powered a water wall that helped cool the building. But it also learnt from the indigenous, if you like, the local architecture, where for generations they've learned how to use water, courtyards, air movement as part of a solution. So when we came to think about our proposal for the sustainability pavilion, we wanted it to be a kind of net zero solution, which of course is extremely challenging in this particular environment. So I think the first part is not the technology, but it's design ingenuity. It's what can you do to minimize the energy load of the building. So for instance, how much of it actually doesn't need any conditioning because it can be external, it can be naturally cooled. And then probably more than half the building was part of a black box experience. It was exhibition space that they wanted to control. So that allowed us to sink it underground. And the whole site was being regraded. So we could sink more than half the building below the ground, which naturally gives it huge thermal insulation. And then the rest of it, we took the landscape up and over the building. And that, of course, also insulates the building. So you're immediately lowering the total heat load on the building. That's the amount of cooling you need. And so you can see here from the slide in the top left-hand corner, that's actually the building. And so it all sits underneath this sort of landscaped roof, which is occupied as part of the experience and sits in an overall landscape. And over that, which I'll come and talk about a bit shortly, there's a canopy, which basically harvests sun. It captures water when there is rain, but more importantly, also brings in breezes and cools the large outdoor courtyard. So quite a substantial part of the building is actually external. And I won't go into too much detail on these diagrams, but I think it explains, if you like, the technical challenge. And so from the earlier stages, we worked with our engineers, Bureau Happold, both on the structures and the MEP systems. And this would be what you'd be achieving for a LEED platinum building and probably above platinum, where you're generating already 40% of your energy on site. So, really best practice. And to get to where we wanted to be, this is where we had to get to. So in other words, no energy coming from external sources. So we're having to generate 4 gigawatt hour power. But really what it also means is you have to be very lean on all the systems. So we were kind of ruthless in where we used energy, and people were given energy budgets. So the exhibition designer, for instance, was given an energy budget he had to design within, which meant, for instance, you might have had an idea of using an aquarium, but aquariums are very, energy hungry, and also I thought inappropriate in this building. So it kind of steered, if you like, some of the thinking to make sure we can live within our kind of energy budget. And it's very much the same picture for water. So again, this would be the same kind of LEED Platinum Building Plus best practice using potable water, recycling water. And this is what we had to get to. So in other words, we had to be very careful on how we use water, how we recycle. Everything has to be recycled, how we deal with waste. And there's actually quite a high water table. So we have the advantage of being able to use the brackish water and through reverse osmosis, which is powered by our PV system, clean the water, but more importantly, we capture water. So all the water, for instance, off the air conditioning as we cool the building is captured and then recycled. So it's really about trying to create closed loop cycles and doing things as efficiently as you can. So this shows you a sort of section through the building. So this is cutting kind of cross section from, if you like, across the building. And from as with the Mobility Pavilion, the Sustainability Pavilion is a permanent building and will be a permanent institute, if you like, a science centre for Dubai, dedicated to sustainability. So we designed it really as a permanent building, and then we re-engineered it effectively as a 6-month temporary building to have a larger volume of people move through it. So in the permanent building, this is the main entrance, and there's an entrance foyer. And then you make your way down to the lower level where you come to the exhibition space, which sits underneath the courtyard. And then basically goes right the way around. And then you have kind of what we call kind of small biome spaces, different gardens, where you have views out into the landscape. And there's also an amphitheatre. However, on Expo, to get more people through, you actually go in reverse. And I'll go into more detail where you come in and we use the courtyard to actually have people circulating and then split them up into different exhibition experiences. So here we are at ground level. There's the main lobby space and some of the galleries at ground level and the courtyard. But as you can see, most of the building is sitting below ground with all the ancillary and support facilities. And then here is the main gallery space that's nestled and then the kind of outer core and inner core that sit underneath the courtyard. So when we did our analysis kind of fairly early on the competition scheme, it became very clear that even covering the entire roof with PVs wouldn't generate enough power to meet the energy goals of the building. And we thought the landscape also was a very important part of the story. So we came up with this idea of actually using a kind of necklace of energy trees around the main building that would also contribute to the energy load and also help shade the landscape below. And so from a technical perspective, about 2/3 of the energy is generated from the roof canopy and 1/3 from the energy trees. And they actually generate more power per square meter because they track the sun. So that increases their yield by about another 1/4. And then for the architects amongst us, we all like looking at drawings. So just giving you another cut through, if you like. And so you can see here the exhibition spaces running underneath the courtyard and beneath the landscape, and then the terrace above and the canopy above that. And often I think we can find inspiration from nature. The natural world does things incredibly efficiently and often with great beauty and elegance. And so for the canopy, the main canopy, there was a sort of inspiration from the gaff tree, which are these amazing trees that could grow in the middle of the desert singularly on their own with very, very deep taproots and give shade to all that find it. So that was really the kind of inspiration for the canopy. The cantilever is about 70 meters from the center to the outer edge, shading everything below it. And here we are as a kind of following on a theme. So blue flag was mobility, green flag was sustainability. And we literally, I think, all started, as Gerard said, sort of 5 years ago or so, with a very, very flat bit of desert and 3 flags basically marking our locations. And so within a matter of months, we got down to the lowest level, cutting down. And you get a kind of feel of scale, I suppose, by looking at a person here. And the ground's relatively soft, and actually it was being regraded across the entire site. So this is the very base of the Sustainability Pavilion, and this is the support structure going in for the canopy. And when the public come in, I'll come on to this, this is actually now a pool of water. And so the water is stored in a series of tanks around a central reservoir, and then there's a sort of feature reservoir which you look down on into. So again, a section cutting through, and you can see here there's the courtyard. So that was the kind of structure we were seeing at the lowest level. And if I just click on, there we go, that's clearer to see. So so there's that lower level, and the structure, there's the courtyard and the surround. And so quite a lot of work went into then making the building as lean as we could and removing what we could. And in particular, the canopy, which is obviously the largest structural element, and importantly, I think a very impactful and visual element. Because I think, the thing about expos is that they're there to kind of, I think, excite, illuminate, and really move people in their imagination, thinking about the future. And so it's important that there is a level of kind of vision. But we wanted the canopy itself to be as efficient and as light as possible. So we worked quite hard with our engineers to basically halve the tonnage, thinking about the structure. And also working on a structure that we could actually use a very high percentage of recycled steel. So there's the canopy and the structure going in place. And of course, the thing about large cantilevered circular structures is they're great once they're in place, but you have to think about how you build them, and each section has to be built one piece opposite the other to balance it out. And then the PVs that sit on top, we did a lot of research into to get highly efficient PVs, but they're also all encased in glass. And that was done both for an efficiency and a safety perspective, but it also has the added benefit that from below you can actually read all the PVs. So for the visitors underneath, being shaded, you get this wonderful view through, and it's almost like a Musharraf screen. You get this sort of dappled light through the PV panels. And then on rethinking and also how we can remove material where we can. I mean, this is a system that's now starting to be used quite widely. And this is one of the first uses of it in the Middle East. And it's basically using the hollow form into the concrete, which reduces the overall concrete in the slab by about 30%. So the contractor actually likes it because it saves money, but more importantly, it removes a massive amount of concrete. And of course, concrete is our biggest challenge as far as the environment goes with its carbon footprint. So we're working quite actively also on alternatives and alternatives to Portland cement in the concrete mix. So then around the building, we also try to use materials, if you like, local materials. And so all below that landscaped roof, the cladding is all in these gabion baskets, all with rocks found quite locally. So you can see that actually they're the same kind of color as the rocks that were excavated out of the site. And so that gives enormous thermal mass to the building, insulates it, but I think it also gives rather a wonderful kind of texture that sits very well with the landscape around it. And here's a view looking down onto the canopy and onto the yew trees. So as I mentioned, the main entrance in the future will be at the highest point where the lobby is. But before that, we'll be using the whole landscape, and around it we have these energy trees. And they were really influenced by these quite wonderful trees found on the southern Yemen tip, which are called dragon trees. And so they basically shade the space below and have these wonderful kind of waxy leaves on this beautiful structure. So for us, we had to design it in a way that would allow us to introduce this gimbal so we could move it. And they're quite large, they're 20 meters across, so it's actually quite a large structure. So in the end, we found a company very nearby that specializes in carbon fibers. They're actually made about half an hour away from the Expo site. And it's a company that does a lot of work with marine work and yachts. It actually works with Foster, I think, on some of the Apple stores. And they have an amazing kind of technology that allowed us to make these very lightweight structures. So you can see here, and again, Using the same PV system, it allows us to have this level of kind of translucency. So you can see, you get the light coming through them, but they provide great shade to the landscape below. So you enter the building and the site through the landscape. And again, this is part of dealing with the very large numbers of people visiting, we hope. And they actually explore the landscape before viewing the building. And we worked with our long-term collaborators, the Eden Project, on a whole series of narratives for the landscape, and a very talented local landscape firm called Desert Inc., who have a great knowledge of local plants. And so a lot of research was done on trying to use plants that haven't been used before, that need very little water, so it's a sort of xeriscape, and really demonstrating you create incredibly impactful landscape, but using the minimum of water. And I think, you know, that hopefully the landscape will tell new stories. So the one on the right, that's a favourite plant of mine, very minor, but it's called a halophyte, which is one of the few plants that can grow, or plant species that can grow in brackish salt water. And so there's a lot of research going on, for instance, at the moment with NASA as well, looking at how you can grow plants in the desert that can actually produce fuel and food, because it just needs salt water and sun, which is the one thing the desert has plenty of. So after making your way through this landscape, you come underneath the canopy, and some people will just go through the landscape, look down into the canopy, and that may be their experience. So we wanted to give them an experience of the site, even if you just walk through it. But hopefully many visitors will then take the time to make their way down through the dry riverbed and come into the courtyard. And from there, you make your way into the central courtyard, where there's a whole series of different kind of experiences and exhibits. And for Expo, what we've done is split it into two. So you then make your way around to two different halves. And by doing that, we can get more people through, but still have a really good quality experience. And for the exhibition, we worked with the Eden Project and the Stockholm Institute of Resiliency. And the themes were the planetary boundaries that Johan Rostrom has been kind of advocating as a way of understanding the stresses on our planet. And so that's been turned into a series of, I would call a kind of analog sort of immersive theatre. And so it's very much a kind of experiential process where we go through two halves, starting with under the forest, through the roots and trees, or under the ocean. And then a whole series of quite confronting at times, but hopefully thought-provoking experiences. And after you make your way through the exhibition, you then come into the outer core. And so that takes you round, where you then make your way into the very heart of the building, right at the centre, which you can see here. And from here, you can actually look up through the building, through the oculus, and see the sky, or look down to the pool of water. And there's this new wonderful kinetic sculpture has just been unveiled, that's sort of, if you like, at the heart of that experience. And then as you come out, there's another lobby, and there's also a space for lectures and debates and discussions that will be part of the long-term use of the building. And all of this is made using recycled wood. And you then come into the lobby. As you make your way up into this space. And of course, all of that is a sort of reverse experience of what you'll have in the long term. And then throughout the building, we've worked with a whole series of artists throughout the building, mostly artists from the region. And so you make your way out through the main atrium space up the upper level. And so this is where you'll start your journey rather than finish your journey when the building becomes a permanent building. And you will enter and your view will be this way, looking out to the canopy, and you'll then disappear underneath and then experience it the other way. And I think the one thing is you don't get a good building without a really good client. And they, you know, Expo could have said, well, we'll do PVs, but we've got a big solar farm nearby, so we can have half of it, you know, poured in, which would be, from an energy perspective, perfectly doable. But it would, you know, lose the magic of demonstrating how you can do everything in a self-contained way. And so our kind of projects were led by Her Excellency Reem Al-Hashimi, who is the joint chair of Expo. And Marjan was really an advocate of everything that we did and gave us great support. And I think ultimately, you know, why are we doing this? Well, you know, the United Nations has made it clear, and there's a conference coming up in Glasgow this November, that we all must be designing carbon net zero buildings by the end of this decade. This decade is an absolutely critical decade. So in many ways, the Expo opens what could be the most important decade for mankind. And we committed a couple of years ago that all of our buildings would be net zero carbon by the end of the decade, and we're finishing 4 more this year. And in fact, we've brought that forwards to 2025 because we want to get to regenerative design by 2030. So we signed in 2019 the World Green Building Council commitment to the net zero campaign, and we thought to walk the talk, you've got to do it. So last year we managed to achieve net zero carbon operations for all of our studios globally. So that's, you know, so I think if you're working with clients, then I think it's important that, you know, you do what you preach. So I think we're all of us looking forward to finally seeing our buildings open and finish. And of course, tomorrow is the first day that the public will be able to experience the whole Expo and see the whole combined projects coming together. So thank you very much, and I will now hand over. I know Simon's now going to complete the picture of the whole Expo site.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That's just fantastic, and I totally agree with the ambitions for net carbon zero. I am rather riveted by your PV rotating trees, which I think is something you're going to need to prototype for the rest of the world so that we can all have a rotating PV tree close to us, collecting solar energy at all times. So I think it's a fantastically inspiring project. Thank you very much. Our third speaker I'm pleased to present is Simon Fraser, who will be presenting Thematic Districts, which is inspired by Expo's sub-themes: opportunity, mobility and sustainability. The petal-shaped districts include 86 buildings that will be used for some country pavilions as well as the main food and retail outlets. Simon Fraser is a principal at Hopkins Architects, and he'll present his approach to design and Hopkins' contribution to architecture in the United Arab Emirates and the thematic districts for Dubai Expo. Simon first joined Hopkins in 1990 and in 1992 won a Leverhulme Fellowship to study in Tokyo. He then worked for the Japanese architect Kishu Kurokawa before returning to Hopkins Architects in 1994. His award-winning project work includes Portcullis House for Westminster in London, the Wellcome Trust's headquarters in London, the Jubilee Campus for the University of Nottingham. Simon has led the practice efforts to establish an international presence since the early 2000s, beginning with the design for GEK's headquarters in Athens and Shin Marunchi Tower in Tokyo, as well as founding the Dubai Design Studio in 2004. The Dubai Studio oversees projects in the wider Middle East, Europe and the Far East, and has delivered many key projects which form part of the modern Dubai. These include the Gate Village at the Dubai International Finance Centre, One Central at Dubai World Trade Centre, and the thematic districts at Expo 2020, the subject of his talk today. So Simon, over to you, last but not least of our presenters.
Thank you. I assume you can hear me. Thank you, Joe. And thank you for Gerard as well at Foster's and Andrew at Grimshaw. Those are lovely buildings you've got there. I mean, really exquisite. And so, yes, I'm going to talk about the thematic districts, which take into account probably about 150,000 square meters in footprint, and overall about 350,000 square meters. And we arrived, you know, it was really at the beginning of the project, really. And we were the first, one of the first to join Expo on the work. And at the beginning of the project there was really just before this, there was just being sand being moved around. And it was a blank canvas in many ways. And that's probably a photograph there with one of our first meetings when I was trying to show these spaces with some shade structures above it. And they said, whatever you do, don't take any photographs outside, which I did. And then that was really what was going on there. It was an amazingly dusty and empty site, which I know Gerard and Andrew have referred to as well. But when we first arrived, it was quite a surprise, and it's amazing to know how they've finished Expo in this period of time, because it's going to be an amazing Expo. A little bit about my story. I mean, I used to travel through Dubai in the mid-70s, early 70s, on the way back from Hong Kong, where I was born and brought up. And Dubai Airport, this is Terminal 1, which is still there. It's a lovely original building, the first airport. And in the distance, you can see the creek, Dubai Creek, and the Bastakir there. And it was very much in my mind when we started various projects in Dubai, the importance of a sense of place. As this was an image of me traveling back from Hong Kong through different cities, and particularly in the Middle East as well, where we would stop over. But Dubai was one I remembered very particularly, and the Bastakir, which is an older shot on the top left, which shows you the scale of the Bastakir district and the creek itself, the courtyards, the more human scale of spaces. I mean, it's lovely when you walk through it. An old friend of mine, Peter Jackson, showed it me again in the early 2000s when buildings were still, some of them being demolished. Hearing bird song, no cars, just pedestrian streets is a real inspiration to this. And I think this is something we called to make it an Emirati Expo, the Emirates, to be part of that. It's very much, I think, in people's hearts. And creating a sense of space is really important when you create something like an Expo, because many of them are, as Andrew and Gerard have referred to, have been, become quite desolate places after they're finished, and they're not sustainable. So looking at the Bastakir itself, this organic courtyard, a series of courtyards and streets, was something that we proposed as the basis for our buildings. And on the top right there is the Sheikh Said's house, and that I think is drawn, this elevation, by Peter Jackson, who has introduced me to many finer details of it, of the wind towers and things like this. So if you can see there, which I'll come to later on, the proportion, the rhythm of windows, the level of detail in the building, this is something that interested us in many of the ways we were going to approach this project. And of course, in some of these other buildings here in Cairo and other cities in the Middle East, of naturally ventilated spaces, self-shaded streets. I mean, there's a lot of beauty in the historic Arab city. And also, that's an aerial view of the Bastakir again, and particularly something close to my heart across the Gulf on the other side in Iran, in Isfahan, and other cities like that. You can find these incredible souks and meandering streets. So a different series of spaces, all pedestrianized, and this quality of a route from one place to another, which we wanted to try and imbue in our Expo project, in our master plan for it. So that's something I want to return to as we go on. But to talk about the thematic districts themselves, this is a plan of Dubai around about a few years ago, within where you see the red dot 4, that's the Expo site. You can see the Jumeirah beach on the top side there, and towards the creek, and the top right is where I've been talking about the Bastakir, the origins of Dubai and the creek itself. Oops. So when we arrived, there was, as I said, a very plain, blank site. You can start to see the edges of the city encroaching on it, on the edge of the Expo site, and this rapidly started to become something we were building very quickly and resolving issues as the other people joined in. And as Andrew and Gerard have said, it was a competition, and the proposals for the thematic districts for other competitors were larger buildings, and we wanted to try and fragment them down to get this core idea of these natural streets. So you can see some of our early sketches in the bottom corner there, showing the permeability and the routes through to try and connect through. We didn't know at the time about Grimshaw's project or Foster's project or any other projects at the time. Those hadn't been selected. So what we were trying to do was to create an urban district which could adapt. And actually, as it turned up, parts of the site were chopped off so that the other buildings could be incorporated into it. And they matched them very well. And that's something we all worked closely together to do. So this was a model that we did very early on, just to get the kind of mixture of different types of buildings, the different country pavilions. I mean, there's about 136 countries all involved in these districts. And so before we had shading structures in the center of the space there was just trees and a series of courtyards to get those things to work as well. There's a car park below, which will be used for other things in the future, not just a car park, but to get them to all align through, we have to think carefully of that. And you can start to see the top corner there, an identity for another site, which would then be incorporated. This is an early sketch I did to show the types of streets and spaces, try and keep the streets as narrow as possible, centralized spaces for natural ventilation, for potential PV cells on the roofs and things like this, and to incorporate that. So that was a pretty early diagram we had here. We had these different layers of the fragmented boxes, really, essentially, of the buildings with the spaces in between. And then you can start to see there the shade structures on the top right-hand side. And this was an element, we had to sort of mix around things and move things together as we went along. This is just a scale comparison of the site on London, central London. There's Trafalgar Square, which is the central Al Wasl Plaza, and then all the districts coming off. And that's, you can now see Grimshaw's pavilion there and the Foster pavilion there as well afterwards. I think this is jumping this slide, but anyway, I'll keep going. A further development there with showing more of the context. In order for it to be developed into a legacy project, those streets and roads around it, which are pedestrian routes, will eventually be incorporated into roads. So there's this idea of a meandering route between the buildings, from the Mobility Pavilion there through to the Al Wasl Plaza. Ideally, that would have been connected directly into the central space of the Al Wasl Plaza, but then a hotel was positioned there. But that's what happens when you're building a city and working with other different people. But I think you can see there that permeability there, and you can see a hierarchy between the actual exhibition spaces and the stair towers, which are the dark rectangular forms. And that's going back to that lovely meandering route in Isfahan, which hopefully we've achieved something of that natural route there. And this was an image we created just as Foster's and Grimshaw had completed their concept designs, and we incorporated it into this aerial view of what we were proposing there for all the streets and spaces in the main Al Wasl Plaza, which was a lower dome building. They eventually went on to build it as a larger building in the end. And then this was, I think someone's actually put this on a speed thing. It's moving itself. This was an early idea of the shade structures, very, very light shaded spaces, and then all the different pavilions with the characteristics of the countries as they'd come along. So these were one of the larger spaces in it. And then these were some early ideas we had as well for sustainability. And we had come up with this idea of a square, circle, and triangle to try and identify the different spaces, the different districts. And that's something we showed at our concept design or post-concept design there for the space. And then as we developed it up further, pavilions themselves could come along, countries could come along and personalize them with a wrap, as we call it, an external layer of additions to the buildings, which could provide more identity. And then these could be reused as well for other buildings later on, these elements, but they come off the core central building. And then this was some night views of the space, because we realized that a lot of the time these buildings are going to be used at night time. So I think it's going to be open to 2 a.m. as well, the Expo. So predominantly a lot of things will happen at night. And something that's of interest to me at the time, to make sure that the streets of these thematic districts are not too bright, because in many ways the building Hopkins had designed are supporting, you know, other buildings, like there's fantastic buildings at Foster's and Grimshaw and all the country pavilions around, to let them be more expressed. And so I was working on a project in Tokyo at the time and seeing the central areas of Ginza. This is Ginza in Tokyo. You get this incredible bright lights in the main streets, which I would say is like the Expo main streets. And then suddenly you take 1 or 2 streets back and you come into these really nice human scaled streets. And that's what we'd like to try and achieve for the thematic districts, that kind of place where you can sit out, have a coffee or have something to eat in smaller streets, take a break from the big events that are happening around about. So these are the kind of feelings we were designing at the time when we were doing our concept with Spears and Major, our lighting designers, to get the lighting levels lower as much as possible on the structures. So hopefully when people are going around, that's what they'll feel. And it's a kind of retreat, a place to go away from the main buildings once you get that kind of museum fatigue, and take a break in these kind of smaller spaces in between. And you can see there, it's not so clear, but in some ways I'm just looking at that now, Gerard, how our shade structures sort of suit your nice curves of your building, of the Mobility Pavilion, and how they work through. And then these are, bear in mind, I must emphasize, the work we did, all the buildings we did, were incredibly efficient budgets. I mean, they're not much more than the cost of a car park. And we had to deal with that kind of efficiency in the way we designed and handled these buildings, because there's a lot more external surface area of it. So that's probably about only a year and a half or so ago, where the buildings were all starting to come together, and you can start to see how things are working through. So a few points here about how we worked on the facades and the building spaces. We built plywood mock-up models to get, and working in conjunction with local contractors to get the facades to be on budget, but also to have them structurally efficient. That's that protrusion of the concrete coming out in the frame there, to make sure you get the corners right, to get the patterning on the concrete right. We didn't use some of those patterns there. And then back, I hope people can see the proportion and rhythm of the original Bastakir districts and how we've tried to incorporate that. And we tested this out on a series of mock-ups where there was nothing else there at all on these buildings here, to work through junctions. And eventually this became one of their media centers and for Expo, and they started to occupy them and use them and stuff. But we were looking at different types of concrete, different plant species, water fountains, different ways of using these wraps to explain the different countries and identities of the pavilions. So that's the base building there, with these node points which things can be fixed onto, and that will eventually become the legacy project once all these wraps have taken off. But I mean, it's a real achievement to the team. There's a whole group of people here working on it to get these things on budget and right. It's incredibly tight budgets. I mean, I'm not joking. It's a little bit more than a reasonable car park. And so we had to work carefully to get the proportions right, to get these things, get the detailing right. And this is all working with local contractors, local companies, just virtually a few thousand meters away near the site. So there's some early shots before the wraps have come in with our shade structures, shading the streets, the plantings starting to come in, some PV cells in certain buildings coming up. And the shade structures will move as well, which I'll come on to. So different patterns on the facades, working through those things there. And then you get this quality of shaded light across and speckled light across the facades. So developing, these are the last few slides here, developing the shade structures This is Al Ain, a palm grove just outside Dubai. And this isn't a photoshopped image, but it's actually a real image of it. And it's really something beautiful when you go there, that quality of permeated light, sunlight coming through the leaves and across the groundscape. And it really was an inspiration to us to see how you could shade the streets in that with that speckled quality of light. This is a slightly more developed post-concept design here, showing all the different types of local species of plants and the shading structures there as they start to be developed. So you get that quality of the main shading structures through the central streets and then side streets off, which are very, very tight, narrow streets leading onto that central route. And you can see the Mobility Pavilion in the distance there as it leads up towards it. This was an early image where we were starting to use, think of discs in space, and working with a really great engineer, Steve Webb. This is his sketch showing, and he, with us trying to encourage him to use as little materials as possible, he came up with these really good sketches for how the buildings came together, how the shade structures came together. I mean, they really are truly light. And in fact, as always with Steve, he pushed it right to the edge. And we got this incredibly light structure to the extent that these started to move, the masts and everything, with a breeze. And people were calling up and saying, you know, the shade structures are moving, you know, because they hadn't been tied together yet. But they were incredibly light panels, which all individually move. This is a model we made in London, which we then took to Dubai. And this shows how hopefully you can see that, how all the panels move together with the wind. So this is starting to see the whole spaces come together. There's about 60 of these shade structures. The up view, looking up into the spaces, you get this quality of very, very light structures, incredibly light structures with a pattern of light on the buildings and on the streets, and an up view there of the panels. And you can see the square patterning relates to one district, circle to another district, triangle to a different district. And you can see that as we go across. This is some of the stair towers looking out, service towers there, and then most of the buildings starting to really be completed there, and you can see the whole project coming together. I think this is actually about 2019, late 2018, 19. Some of the wraps coming on there, which will then have screen printed images and colors on the buildings to identify the different countries. They're added on there. And then some of the spaces coming to fruition as well there. And then gradually, as they get much more planted and they start to grow, they start to become very, very lush. Last few slides here, some evening shots with the lights coming through of the things. And then finally, as Gerard and Andrew have also mentioned about legacy, this is going to be the Expo forms part of, oops, get my cursor in here, but Expo forms part of the new airport that's nearby, which will be a logistics city. And that legacy component, which Andrew also showed the same image, is something we've been working on to convert the buildings as soon as Expo is finished into apartments, places for people to live and work, small startup businesses, and things like that. So that's what we've been working on as well for legacy. So it really is an Expo that's going to continue on and be a proper piece of city. So all those Expo buildings going to convert into these smaller apartments as time goes on. And one last thing is I must just say thank you to all the different people. There's a much wider team than this, but this is one of our last photographs before COVID kicked in. And thank you to particularly to Gary White and Andrew Ardle, John Messenger, and many, many others who have been working very hard on the project. And that's a final last image there of the setting sun. I think I've done it, tried to keep it as fast as possible for you. Joe?
Simon, I'm not live yet. Simon, that was great and very timely, so thank you very much.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, you were doing good.
Time is moving on.
Yeah, no, so, thank you very much. It's very inspirational. I'm now starting to get itchy feet to travel, which in a post-COVID era would be a good sense to be able to actually go and see these buildings. Very inspiring. Thank you very much. We've actually got some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to try and move on to that in order that we can get some discussion and Q&A going. One of the questions is, how do the various pavilions talk to each other, given that they're so close to each other, but are different thematically? And I'm actually going to come back to you, Simon, because I actually think you have a slide, and what we haven't seen today is how your buildings and the Fosters and the Grimshaw Pavilion sit in a site plan. So for those people who don't know that, could you answer that question for us, Simon?
Yeah, I'll try to. Let me just get back to a plan. I think there's one up here.
While you're getting back to the plan, the next question that I'm going to ask is about the carbon footprint of each of everybody's projects. So that gives a little bit of forewarning to the other two people on this call to prepare their answers. So
I think, yeah, I mean, just to answer that, I think they don't exactly talk to each other, but they integrate. I mean, and this isn't a great plan really, because Grimshaw's team and our team work really closely together to morph and connect these spaces together. We've got a very nice merging of our two projects here, and also with Foster's building as well. We dipped in here and worked with everyone on Gerard's team as well to get that to work right. I think the only thing I would say about them talking is that people would meander through these routes and connect through as you walk through, if that helps. But as far as I know, the speaking to each other, they are different buildings.
Yeah. So, but they are. I mean, effectively, they walk. Everyone walks through your buildings to get to one of the.
Yeah, I mean, you can walk through that way and permeate that way across into the site there, or you can walk around all these other different country pavilions. These pavilions around about the edges of, for example, of sustainability, there will be individual pavilions, and they don't. The thing about expos is that everyone is trying desperately, apart from maybe these three, but everyone is trying very clearly to identify their country, and they're all individual components. In fact, I think at one of the presentations I said at the beginning is that we're sort of like the supporting actor role, our project, to allow these other, star roles come out, and we support that in the same way as a normal city, a good city, where you get possibly those images I was showing of Isfahan or something. You get the mosque, you get the supporting texture and granularity of a city, of normal buildings supporting the special buildings.
Great. I mean, they really are the culmination at the petal, aren't they? They're the icing on the cake, or whatever you want to say. They're the That's the star of the show at the end of each petal.
Yes, that's right. It's a good way of explaining it. Yeah, I've never thought of it that way, but yes, exactly.
Yeah. And
so
I think it's fair to say,
very proud.
I was going to say that they've tended to cluster national pavilions around the themes that have more of an emphasis on one of the themes. So, for instance, the countries that were more interested in emphasising sustainability, such as the Netherlands and Malaysia and so on, around sustainability, whereas ones that were exploring more mobility themes around mobility and so on. So there's a sort of clustering that way as well.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, while you're on, can you tell me about the carbon footprint of the Grimshaw project?
So I should, of course, I should have realised I should have had this to hand to be absolutely scientific about it, and I don't. But if you go to our website, we've just today put up our kind of case study that has got all the kind of details about the actual carbon footprint and content of the building. But what I can say is considerably lower. Basically, the way you currently benchmark for net zero carbon is it's against best practice and how much lower you are against that. And we are working towards being one of the first of the new LEED net zero carbon buildings rated. So LEED have brought out a new kind of, if you like, rating that sits above platinum, which is net zero carbon. And so we're currently working, and it's quite a lot of work working towards that. So so if you want to get into the real weeds, the details, then if you go to our website, I think you can get a lot more detail there.
Great. Well, maybe I can ask both Fosters and Hopkins to put similar detail on their websites, because we've got quite a lot of interesting questions here. So I'm going to thank you for that answer and move on to the next one, which is, were any of the pavilions actually changed due to the COVID pandemic? And if so, how? Or were all these designs effectively just delayed? Could I start with Gerard on the Fosters pavilion? Did you have to change due to COVID or just delay?
No, we had a delay because of the COVID situation. I think the only thing that's changed is I think they're reducing the flow and throughput into the building because they want more social distancing in the building. But no, and I think what's important is that, you know, the pavilion is working outside as well as inside in the same way as Andrew's pavilion. You know, they've got great outdoor spaces, and I think that's something that is going to be very important post-COVID. That, you know, exhibitions just aren't just inside, and I think that the more outside space which is used in the Expo will be, you know, that will be all to the benefit. And I think certainly, you know, I think the spaces as you move around Expo are all, you know, it's a lovely place to just sit and move, and I think that's one of the successes of this Expo. And I think the fact it's got a legacy is very important.
Simon, do you want to add to that in terms of the distribution through the petals between your buildings, in terms of any changes?
We didn't make any changes because, coincidentally, that's what was working fine. Everyone naturally flows around. In fact, there was a lovely Peter Zumthor building at the 2000 Hanover Expo, which was built of wood. And the great thing about it was it had no queuing issues, because as soon as people started to get more crowded in one area, just sort of people moved on. And so ensuring that these spaces, these streets and spaces are there, and not making one building, but fragmenting everything, actually helps. But no, we didn't, unfortunately, most of the work had been done by the time COVID hit. So we didn't change really much at all. We didn't have to react to it at all. But I think it's a telling point about the fact you try and make a lasting urban city. That's what this Expo is going to be about, is you create this core where, you know, it can be quickly changed over, it's adaptable, it's long lasting, and those things, you know, COVID comes and it's probably responded very well to it, as everyone else has said. So.
Great. So I'm now going to ask a more technical question that's come in, which is about metal and how people have dealt with heat expansion or compensation for heat. Andrew, would you like to just comment on that, on your large which is recycled, and how the heat
steel?
Do
you want me to change my screen, or?
I don't know if Andrew wants to share.
You keep going.
Well, maybe some go to the aerial one of the whole thing. That's what we wanted to have as a holding one, isn't it? Well, for the canopy itself, which is the main use of steel on our project, I mean, it's actually relatively easy in that it's freestanding. So we don't have the normal problems you would have in a building where you've got interfaces with, you know, cladding systems, envelopes, and so on. So you know, it can actually move relatively easily, and obviously we've built in a level of expansion joints and so on. And the main thing is really the only interface we have is with the solar, the PVs that sit on top. And again, you know, there's expansion built into those. So it's not really an issue. And then the rest of the building is actually mostly, of course, below ground, and the E-trees are actually carbon fibre.
Great. Well, I think that probably answers that question. The next question is to Gerard at Foster's, about whether your building will be still fully accessible when this platform for 160 people at a time is removed in its legacy state.
Yes, 100%. It's fully accessible. It has additional lifts, and they will be working. And I think what's very important is that, you know, it's accessible for all through the same system, not only during the expo, but also after the expo. And I think that's, you know, there's no you can move around the building internally has ramps to move down through the building. And so the building is really truly open to everybody, and that was something that we felt was very important, was that there was no prevention of anybody moving through and seeing the whole experience. So yes, it's a seamless experience through ramps and through the platform during the expo, and it transforms into a similar experience afterwards.
But the tracks all stay, so you'll still be able to trace back.
The tracks all stay, and yes, it'll be very interesting to see how they get used later.
Fantastic. Okay, so there's another question which is about, for Andrew, I think, which is about carbon offsetting. What carbon offsetting has been required in order to reach net carbon zero?
Yep, so we worked with a couple of different companies, and again, we're about to publish that, so I haven't published it yet, on the carbon offsetting, and there's some very good programs going on. And so we did this actually initially to have our own carbon net zero ambitions met for our operations. And in particular, we're working with a company that works in Africa, but there are a number of programs to do with reforestation, as well as also opening up greater equality for sort of access to water and so on. So the great thing about the carbon offsetting is that it's also an opportunity for you to fund and support really ambitious and you know, programs that actually help the developing world. And so, you know, I should just talk maybe a little bit about our own practice. We felt, rather than doing sort of more technology-based things in the West or reforestation, that we would like to fund projects that really help developing countries. So, you know, and we actually host a competition, kind of like a quiz across the office, or if you like, ask people what they would like to do, and I'll give them different opportunities and projects to support. So I think, you know, that's the opportunity. It's not just the technical offsetting, but actually the ability to use this as a force for change and a force for good to really support projects, you know, that wouldn't have had the level of support they would have had up until this point.
Great. Well, thank you very much. There's now a question which is about design responsibility ratios, which seems quite technical, but I'm actually going to rephrase it in a slightly different way and ask whether all of you actually continued as the lead architects through the whole process, or were you did you have executive architects? How was the structure? Andrew, I mean, could you all answer this in turn? Starting with Andrew, because he's live.
Sure. I think it's the same for all of us. I think we were, because we shared an office. Grimshaw and Foster shared a project office, and we were both there throughout, leading not just the design process but the construction with our, you know, collaborating engineers. So we both had quite substantial teams on site throughout the process. It actually is still involved, because, you know, the usual final operational things, and then a continued one, of course, with the legacy work that we've got to make changes to the building.
Yeah. I mean, if that's true for everybody, I move on to a rather good question that's just come in.
No, I just wanted to say, because it's a very important thing, because it is interesting, because sometimes a lot of architects, you know, do a concept and then it gets delivered by someone else. But I do think it really is important for the initial sketch, the person who thinks that, is continuing all the way through to the end. And certainly for us, and I know Foster's and Grimshaw as well, but for us at Hopkins, the same people on site, even from the concept all the way through, you know, and that group of people I showed you there, were there at the beginning right the way to the end. It's a really fantastic journey. Great, you know.
Well, that's very exciting, because I'm sure it ends up in a better quality of building. So.
Yeah, I mean, right down to the door handle and the fixing of the bolt fixing. It's great, you know. It's really, you know, the same kind of people, you know, that shading structure difficulties there. Someone who is working out something on a concept has been Stefan has been dealing with, you know, some panels and things like this and some bolts on the shading structures, and it's really interesting. Very, very, very interesting journey.
So I'm going to ask, one of the interesting questions that's now come in is about software. What softwares have been used for modelling such wonderful buildings? I'm going to pass that to Gerard, who was talking about his BIM process.
We did everything in Revit, and worked through the whole BIM model with that, and also Rhino was fairly fundamental early on. Yeah, you know, there was a lot of parametric modelling, and you know, a lot of research in terms of how we were going to transfer the data to the metal workers for the facade, and obviously the facade was probably the most challenging element. And again, I picking up on Simon and Andrew's points, I think without our team on site and our teams following through, we would never have achieved the quality that has been achieved, because there's somebody there looking and understanding it, and that was, so you know, the person who generated it in the machine is also the person on site, and I think that's an incredibly important part of the process.
Definitely. Yeah.
I'm sure of value to clients, but also an extraordinary experience for all the team involved. I'm going to ask, I think, nearly my last question. There's a question here about the various solar shading solutions are innovative and look very delicate, particularly the Hopkins trees. How are extreme weather conditions, i.e. sandstorms, going to be mitigated, high wind, sandstorms, etc., in your design?
That's part of the design. It's in fact, we had one, that's what I was referring to. There was a storm in about February where before the shade structures were connected together, and they really started to move around. I mean, it was quite surprising, but as soon as they're connected together and as soon as the shade structure panels, as soon as the wind picks up, the panel flips and opens up. I mean, it's a really nice resolution that we worked through with Steve Webb and others to get that right. But yeah, we're very confident that's a long-lasting shading solution. But to get something as elegant as that, and so, you know, they're very inexpensive, these things, they're very reduced right down, but to get it really on the line is tough work by a lot of people. Yeah. Well, I think we should all be very proud of our RIBA architects working on these extraordinary projects in the Dubai Expo. I hope that many people will come and visit it. I'm not quite certain how long it's open for, and when the remodelling starts for the legacy project. Perhaps next 6 months. Next 6 months. It's open for 6 months. So as soon as it finishes, the work starts on converting it to legacy. So these buildings will continue very soon as a proper working city. So that was the overall vision from the Expo client, to make sure it didn't, you know, remain empty for a year or something. It kicks in and opens up as a legacy project. Well, I'm super proud, and I hope that these projects have been now incentivize other people to visit the Expo. And thank you very much to all our speakers, to Simon, to Andrew and to Gerard, and also to the RIBA team for organising the event today. So thank you all for listening. Thank you very much for the interesting questions in the Q&A. They've been very helpful and very interesting, and we hope that you've enjoyed the conversation today. So it's goodbye from me in London, and I'll let our speakers say goodbye as well. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Yeah, goodbye from Dubai. We're very hot. Party.
That's right. 35 degrees outside, actually.
Yeah, I know. I'll see you in the heat, Simon. Shortly.
Yes, see you. Yeah, you should bring your shorts.
Enjoy your open party, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.